the center would not be listed on the county's register. It's only a determination of eligibility, which then reflects the determination on historic significance. And I will try and unpack some of that in my presentation. This all began back in 2019. There was some painting that occurred on some of the buildings. At that time, HCD became aware of the painting, and an inspector requested that the contractor and the owner apply for a design approval to change the colors of the building. And they did that. There was quite a bit of interest in what was going to occur outside of the painting. On that design approval application, HCD sent the matter to the Carmel Valley Land Use Advisory Committee for review on July 15, 2019. And among other recommendations, the advisory committee suggested referring this matter to the Historic Review Board. They then continued the hearing from the Land Use Advisory Committee and made a recommendation with some other suggestions, but that has to do with the design approval, and I won't go into those. As it relates to the historic determination, the applicant then had Dr. Anthony Kirk prepare a historic evaluation for the shopping center, and he submitted that evaluation to the county. That was part of the second review of the Land Use Advisory Committee, and Dr. Kirk found that it did not qualify as a historic resource. In response and in opposition to that, the Carmel Valley Association had prepared another historic analysis from Page and Turnbull. Page and Turnbull's initial determination was submitted as a letter to the county, finding that it did qualify for listing, and then subsequently the actual historic survey was submitted to the county, supporting their conclusion that it did qualify for listing. So that created a situation where there were competing historic opinions. It went on from the Dr. Kirk and Page and Turnbull decisions, competing against one another, to then the applicant hiring two additional historic consultants who both found that it was not historic. That would be Dr. Laura Jones and Dr. Barbara Lamprecht. So those evaluations prepared at the direction of the applicant are both part of your packet and part of the EIR. Separately, Dr. Diana Painter, under contract with the county's EIR consultant, prepared a separate historic analysis, and she found that it was historic. So we have two historians suggesting that it is qualifies for listing as a historic resource, and three from that suggest that it is not. When there are competing historians or expert opinions, CEQA directs that an environmental impact report should be prepared, and that is required to analyze the difference in opinions, and it also requires that we treat it as significant for the purposes of preparing the EIR as an informational document. So we worked with the applicant, we prepared a draft EIR, we circulated it for public review, and received 3 comment letters, one from the Carmel Valley Association supporting their prior position that it should be determined eligible for listing as a historic resource. A couple of letters from some neighbors along Center Street behind the shopping center that were concerned about buffers, given that there's some activity and deliveries happening, particularly behind the Safeway building that used to be buffered with some vegetation, and they wanted that restored. That could be considered as part of the design approval, but that was a comment on the AR. And then we received a comment letter from Mr. Lombardo on behalf of the applicant that actually included the other historic opinion from Dr. Lamprecht. We compiled those comments on the draft EIR and prepared a final EIR that contains responses to those comments, and that has all been put as part of your package before the board. So the real points of disagreement between the historians are that whether or not the project qualifies as a historical resource, and primarily discussions revolve around whether or not Olof Dahlstrand should be considered a master architect. If Olof Dahlstrand is considered a master architect, it could qualify for listing as the work of a master. The arguments went on to cover whether or not the shopping center in its current condition retains integrity of its original design. The integrity question only applies if it's determined to be significant in the first place. Then it needs to also have integrity, and both need to be present in order to be considered a historical resource. Again, the historians had differing opinions along the same lines that I've already described. So the design approval that was analyzed in the EIR had all of this information. It did determine that the board has the authority to designate and determine and declare whether or not the property is a historic resource at the local level. The design approval action is not part of today's action, but the EIR also considered the potential impacts of the design approval if it were considered at some point in the future. And that is not part of the action we're asking for you to consider today, only the determination of significance and the certification of the EIR. So just a little bit on Olof Dahlstrand. This is pretty well documented amongst all the historians. He was graduated from Cornell University and with a degree in architecture. He worked for the Fred and Louise Langhorst in the Bay Area and took over their practice when they moved to Europe. He later worked for Skidmore, Owens & Merrill in the Bay Area, and he had definite inspirations from Frank Lloyd Wright, as are reflected in a lot of his works. He's known for his rendering skills and worked with John Carl Wernicke on the JFK Memorial and renderings for the Del Monte Shopping Center. He designed the original Carmel Plaza, which no longer retains integrity, and the Wells Fargo Bank, which has been determined eligible for listing in the city of Carmel's historic resources, and his work is documented and recorded in the Environmental Design Archives at the UC Berkeley campus. The Mid-Valley Shopping Center was designed by Olof Dahlstrand in the 60s at a time when Carmel Valley was transitioning from a mostly agricultural setting to a more residential suburban setting, and it does contain similarities with some of Dahlstrand's other works. As it pertains to today's item, I have a lot of words on the screen here, but the definitions of a historical resource under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, have kind of four parts to it. Really, at issue here is there are surveys that have identified that the center could be historical, and there are some that haven't. There's a determination by the lead agency, which is us, the Board of Supervisors, on whether or not it qualifies for listing. I have some information here on the standards for that, but I'll let County Council address that if I could take a moment.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and members of the board. Just a brief discussion on the standards applicable in making your determinations. As Mr. Spencer has said, we're really looking at what the CEQA guidelines talk about in terms of what is a historic resource, when it is to be accepted that it is one, when it is presumed to be one, and when it is up to you to decide that it is one. So here, as Mr. Spencer indicated, we have two what are called historical resource surveys under CEQA and pursuant to the Public Resources Code. So the initial decision to determine whether or not the structure is a historic resource falls under A2, which is at the top of the screen. And because of the surveys, it is presumed to be a historical resource, and that is why the EIR presumed it to be a historical resource. However, the board may find that it's not, based upon a preponderance of the evidence. And let me just talk briefly about what that means. So I'm going to quote from some court decisions on what it means, because there are different definitions on what preponderance of the evidence means. One court has said it simply means what it says, that the evidence on one side outweighs or preponderates over, is more important than the evidence on the other side, not necessarily in the number of witnesses or quantity, but in its effect on those to whom it is addressed. Preponderance of the evidence has also been defined as meant such evidence as, when weighed with that opposed to it, has more convincing force, and from which it results that the greater